So that's the deep root, one might say, of the blood libel. But it emerges as a kind of narrative in the sort of high medieval centuries, 12th century, 13th century, where the bizarre narrative begins to circulate in one place after another in Western Europe that the Jews who are living among Christian communities, of course, as a persecuted minority, let's not forget the various disabilities, legal and otherwise, and the forms of hatred and contempt that they were submitted to, are victimizing Christians by kidnapping Christian children, ritually murdering them in a manner that is a deliberate, blasphemous parody of the crucifixion of Jesus. That's the blood libel in its sort of primary form. And one might think, how idiotic, how grotesque. Well, it worked. What it worked to do was to convince a victimizing majority that the victimized minority among them was victimizing them, so they needed to take revenge. And it whipped up pogroms, it whipped up massacres, it whipped up trials and executions, and in other words, not just a mobilization of mobs, but a mobilization of state functionaries and, of course, ecclesiastical functionaries against this persecuted minority. One might say, well, okay, that's a long time ago. What does this have to do with us? Well, the blood libel, of course, continued to be circulated in more or less that form well into the 20th century. And it still pops up. There was recently, I think in 2003, a program on Syrian television, which resuscitates in that form the blood libel. I haven't seen it myself, I only know it by report. But that's not the kind of thing that gets talked about by exponents of the New-Antisemitism. Their concern, rather, and you might remember this when the Goldstone report appeared. Alan Dershowitz, who was the Harvard law professor who was recently in Vancouver speaking, was falling all over himself to denounce this report as not merely a blood libel, but an aggravated blood libel. Aggravated, of course, by the fact that Judge Richard Goldstone is Jewish and a lifelong Zionist, as it happens, and a man of principle. Now, what can that mean? The Goldstone report is a blood libel, or a report by Human Rights Watch which investigated and substantiated an incident in which Palestinian women and children in January 2009 emerged waving white flags from a building that was under fire and were shot by Israeli soldiers. Human Rights Report investigated this and said this is clearly a war crime that needs to be investigated by the state and to result in proper legal action and so on. Now, that was denounced as a blood libel. What's going on here? Well, what's going on is evidently an attempt to claim that the deployment of the universal language of human rights, when it's directed against actions of the State of Israel, is merely a kind of hypocritical and sophisticated resurgence of ancient hatreds that used to express themselves in different forms. These are now displaced. Instead of saying you're murdering Christian children, we're saying you're murdering Palestinian civilians. And it is a blood libel. It is an expression of hatred. It is anti-Semitism. That's the claim, improbable as it may seem. Now, the effect of that kind of rhetoric is, of course, to displace any concern with the actual evidence. You know, in any accusation of this sort, there's a need for close and scrupulous and skeptical analysis of evidence. But this kind of rhetoric is designed to do something else. It's designed actually as another instance of what Professor Kotler calls lawfare. If it is lawfare, a kind of legal warfare to use human rights discourse and principles against the State of Israel, then he's in effect saying, let's use lawfare in reverse. This country has many countries now have, to their credit, legislation against the dissemination of hatred, against the dissemination of racism and so on. Okay, if I can plausibly pin the label of anti-Semitism on the person who's made this claim against the state, against the actions, whatever they might be, of a state, they become the defendant. Why? Because in effect they are victimizing the state that they're attacking by recirculating these ancient libels. Notice once again we have an inversion of victimizer and victim. In this case, the victims are effectively forgotten about. At least that seems to be the hope. That we're not going to talk anymore of what may or may not have happened in this or that incident. Instead, we're going to talk about your need to defend yourself from a crime of loathsome hate speech, dissemination of hatred, and so on. Now that might seem an extreme example. I can give another one, which is discussed not at length, but it's discussed briefly in the book. In 2006, the English journalist Johann Hari, I don't know if you know his work, he writes for The Guardian newspaper, published a piece in which he was he was commenting on the celebrations which were then about to occur of the 60th anniversary of Israel's founding. And in a kind of slightly jocular tone, Hari began by saying, well, you know, when a 60-year-old one's acquaintance is having a birthday, it's the sort of thing one wants to join in, even, you know, in a kind of celebratory way. But he says, I don't feel I can. And I can't, he says, because I've been recently to the West Bank. Now, by my memory, the article is accompanied by a photograph of Hari standing together with a Palestinian medical officer of health by the outflow spout of a sewage pipe that was disgorging sewage from the village on the top of the hill, in occupied Palestinian land, of course, onto the Palestinian land in the valley. And the medical officer of health is quoted by Hari as saying, you know, this is a serious health problem. It's happening on a quite large scale throughout the West Bank, and it has serious consequences both for the agricultural land which is being spoiled and for Palestinians' right to clean water. There's a very, you know, I mean, E. coli and all the rest of it. This is a serious health danger. Hari also quoted in the same article, it's quite a brief article, but a very densely packed one, from human rights organizations which had studied the issue of sewage disposal in the Gaza Strip. And they'd said, because the Gaza authorities are unable to get access due to the blockade to the necessary equipment to repair their sewage facilities, there are now these vast reservoirs of raw untreated sewage held in by retaining walls, which the human rights organization said are in danger of collapse should there be nothing more severe than a major storm. Right? The water could overwhelm the capacity of the retaining walls with potentially catastrophic results. Now, Hari received a storm of abuse for saying this, and the example that I found most telling was a response by the Community Security Trust, which is a widely respected organization in the UK, which, among other things, publishes annual statistics relating to anti-Semitic incidents in the UK, and does other kinds of things in collaboration with the police in collecting data and in representing aspects of the interests of the British Jewish community. They published a report on anti-Semitic discourse in Britain, 2000 and I'm not sure of the year of the report. It would have been 2006 or 2007, I suppose, in which they give 2 full pages to the case of Johann Hari. They don't go into any detail about the article which set off the storm of criticism and induced him to write a reply to his critics, which induced further criticism. What they say is that Johann Hari prompted criticism because he referred to the 60th anniversary celebrations of Israel and his refusal to participate in the celebrations by having reference to shit and raw sewage. And you read that and you immediately think, oh Lord, I thought Johann Hari was a fairly decent guy. This is a repetition of another one of the disgusting tropes of anti-Semitism, right? Which is the trope of pollution and abjection. This community among us is a pollutant to be associated with all kinds of foulness. It must be kind of flushed away, disposed of, etc. When you're into that kind of speech, you're very close to the language of the Nazis. Right? That is among the vilest of the anti-Semitic tropes. So what they're saying, what they're allowing their readers to take from their account of Johann Hari's writing is this guy is recirculating this stuff. He is expressing the vilest contempt for the people of Israel in scatological terms. Of course he's an anti-Semite. And of course, this should be counted as, among other things, an anti-Semitic incident. Now, there is an example of the reversal of that this rhetoric and ideology of the new anti-Semitism is designed to bring about. I do encourage you to take a look at Johann Hari's article, which is actually very humane. He says, look, we have two people, each of whom has a history of grievous suffering, and surely it's possible to come to an amicable, negotiated, peaceful resolution of this thing. But he's also suggesting, of course, that two things are needed to come to that resolution, and he says it quite openly. One is a recognition on the part of Israelis of the conclusions that their own historians, Benny Morris and others, arrived at in studying the period of the formation of Israel, namely that there was ethnic cleansing. The Palestinians didn't leave because of radio messages summoning them to leave their villages so that the Arab armies could come in and deal with the Haganah. They left because they were driven out by massacres and by terror. And that's well documented, and many Israelis, of course, I think it's important to realize. We criticize Israel. Many Israelis do so in much fuller and more open terms than occurs in this country.